The name of Henry Fuseli may not be all that familiar, but his most famous painting, The Nightmare, certainly is. It's a powerful image that influenced countless other painters and writers that came after him, and in more recent times, filmmakers. After 240 years, it remains fresh and still has an unnerving quality that hints at things that should perhaps be left unseen. Welcome to Insane History. I'm Graeme Yorston, and today I'm exploring the life of Henry Fuseli, painter of strange, otherworldly, but surprisingly modern pictures. To find out how a Swiss-born ordained minister ended up in London painting erotically charged works of art, and how his most celebrated painting, The Nightmare, connects to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Henry Fuseli was born Johann Heinrich Fuseli in 1741 in the canton of Zurich in Switzerland. His father was a prominent painter of portraits and landscapes and author of a book on the lives of Swiss painters. His mother, Elisabeth Vasa, had 18 children, with Johann Heinrich being the second born. Fuseli grew up in a comfortable and cultured household in which art, literature and science were as much part of his diet as his morning muesli. One of his brothers became a painter and entomologist, and two of his sisters, Elisabeth and Anna, became celebrated flower painters. His father considered young Henry too clumsy to be an artist, and thinking he was better suited to the church, sent him to the Carolinum College of Zurich, where he received a traditional classical education. But he was also exposed to the more enlightened thinking of philosopher Johann Bodmer, who argued for freedom of imagination in literature, believing that poetry should evoke wonder and engage the emotions, allowing writers to explore the sublime and fantastical. One of his schoolmates there was Johann Caspar Lavater, who later became a poet and philosopher whose writings on physiognomy, specifically the idea that character traits could be discerned through lines of countenance, contributed to the 18th century craze of silhouette making. At the age of 20, Fuseli became a pastor in the Evangelical Reformed Church of Zurich, a slightly less severe form of Swiss Calvinism inspired by the teachings of Huldrych Zwingli. But 2 years later, after working with his friend Lavater on a pamphlet criticising the corruption of a government official in the town of Grüningen, he was forced to leave Zurich or face the consequences from a connected family seeking revenge. It seems then, as now, the powerful stop at nothing to remain powerful, crushing anything or anyone they perceive as a threat. Travelling through a Europe devastated by the 7 Years' War, he stopped off in Berlin to spend time with philosopher Johann Joachim Spalding, author of an influential book, Reflections on the Destination of Man, considered to be a manifesto of the German Enlightenment, in which he rejects dogmatic authoritarianism and promotes a more common-sense philosophy of life. Also in Berlin, through his translations of Shakespeare plays into German, he met Sir Andrew Mitchell, the English ambassador to Prussia, who persuaded him he could have a comfortable future in London. Fuseli, who was fluent in 8 languages, initially worked as a translator, but he also enjoyed London's theatre scene and the other entertainments for which it was famous. In 1767, he travelled to Paris as tutor to the 14-year-old Lord Chewton, where he met radical political philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And on his return to London, he published his Remarks on the Writings and Conduct of Monsieur Rousseau. So far in his life, there has been a lot of philosophy and travel, but not much in the way of painting. But in 1767, he met Joshua Reynolds, leading portraitist of Georgian England. Fuseli showed him some of his drawings, and Reynolds was so impressed, he encouraged him to devote himself entirely to art. He lived for a while at the house of his publisher, Joseph Johnson, but in 1770 a disastrous fire destroyed not only Johnson's shop and stock, but all of Fuseli's manuscripts and belongings. So, with nothing to keep him in London, he decided to embark on an art pilgrimage to Italy, where he remained for 8 years, based mainly in Rome, studying the antiquities and works of Michelangelo, spending hours lying on a scaffold admiring the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. But also giving himself time, according to his letters to his friends, to enjoy the other pleasures of the city, which involved him being flat on his back. He moved in the same circles as Swedish sculptor Tobias Sergel and Anton Mengs, the court painter for Charles III of Spain. And it's possible he may also have met Francisco Goya, who was in Rome at the same time. An intriguing possibility given the similarity between some of their works. Eventually, he decided to return to England via Zurich, where he fell in love with Anna Landholt, the niece of his old friend Lavater. But it seems neither Anna nor her father were impressed by his prospects, and his marriage proposal was rejected. But he couldn't stop thinking about her and dreaming about her. He wrote a very obsessive-sounding letter to Lavater. Last night I had her in bed with me, tossed my bedclothes hugger-mugger, wound my hot and tight-clasped hands about her, fused her body and soul together with my own, poured into her my spirit, breath and strength. Anyone who touches her now commits adultery and incest. She is mine and I am hers, and have her I will. Strong stuff for a former minister of religion. But according to his biographer, Henry Fuseli was always very susceptible to the passion of love. Back in London, the prestigious Royal Academy of Arts had moved to new, spacious galleries at Somerset House, and Fuseli began to exhibit regularly at its exhibitions, which soon became an essential part of the London social scene for the upper classes, and his reputation steadily grew. But it was when The Nightmare was shown in 1782 that he really came to public attention. The painting was met with horrified fascination, disquiet at its raw sexuality and unbridled lust, but also curiosity. Everyone wanted to see the scandalous new picture. It tapped into the appetite for a new type of artistic creation, the Gothic shocker. Horace Walpole's Castle of Otranto, published a few years earlier, is generally regarded as the first novel of the Gothic genre, which spawned hundreds of literary works over the next 150 years, with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and Bram Stoker's Dracula being notable examples, along with the stories of Edgar Allan Poe. And Fuseli's Nightmare was one of the first unashamedly Gothic paintings. Before this, the purpose of art was considered to have been the moral betterment of mankind, the depiction of the virtuous, the pious, and the noble. This was different. This was art to excite the imagination, draw on hidden fears, stir up buried desires, and above all, to be sensational. And what could be more gothically sensational than nightmares? We all know what a nightmare is now, but the word meant something quite different in the 18th century. The mare of nightmare has nothing to do with horses, despite Fuseli giving us the red herring of a horse in his painting. Mare is an old Northern European word for a malicious being, a goblin or witch, who sits on the chests of people as they sleep, pressing, paralysing, and making them breathless, sometimes fatally. It is closely linked to the older idea of the incubus, a male demon who forces himself sexually on sleeping women. the earliest descriptions of which go back almost 5,000 years to the Epic of Gilgamesh of the ancient Sumerians. Incubus could mean both the demon itself and the illness it caused that disturbed the sleep of its sufferers. An early German medical text from 1561 by surgeon and alchemist Hieronymus Brunschwig states, "The disease called incubus, that is the mare, which is a sickness or fantasy oppressing a man in his sleep, that to him seemeth a great weight lie upon his body, wherefore he groaneth and sigheth, but cannot speak." The first English-language neurology textbook, Robert Pamell's 1560 De Morbis Capitis, or Of the Chief Internal Diseases of the Head, includes incubus as a specific disorder, but declares that the ideas of demons causing the illness are but the conceits of men. Nevertheless, in his Dictionary of the English Language, published 100 years later, and just 27 years before Fuseli's picture was unveiled, Samuel Johnson very much continues with the old ideas of a Mara being a spirit from northern mythology that torments or suffocates sleepers, by a morbid oppression in the night resembling the pressure of weight upon the breast. So, the nightmare in Fuseli's painting was not the young lady sprawled out on the bed, but the mischievous goblin sitting smilingly on her chest. But perhaps even more revealing of the thought processes of its creator is the picture on the back of the canvas, an unfinished portrait of a young woman. We don't know for certain who she is, but it's been suggested that she is Anna Landhold, the woman who rejected Fuseli's marriage proposal in Zurich, and that the nightmare portrays his unfulfilled erotic fantasies with himself as the lustful demon and Anna as the powerless maiden. Fuseli's painting was produced at the height of the scientific enlightenment, when reason and scholarly inquiry were replacing superstition and traditional authority. One of Fuseli's rare portraits is of Joseph Priestley, polymath, religious dissenter, and discoverer of oxygen. Yet the nightmare powerfully evokes an older, less rational world that is both attractive, harkening back to some mythical golden age of simplicity, but scary. He sold the picture for 20 guineas, around the average annual income for a working-class family, and painted several other versions with slightly different compositions over the next few years. An engraving was also made that made its publisher several £100, but Fuseli very little. However, on the back of its popularity, Fuseli was commissioned to paint a series of Shakespeare-themed pictures by engraver John Boydell, who was setting up a Shakespeare gallery. He also continued his translating work, publishing an English edition of his friend Lavater's work on physiognomy, and assisted William Cooper in preparing his translation of Homer. In 1788, at the age of 47, Fuseli married Sophia Rawlins, one of his models, a country girl from Somerset, and they moved into an elegant townhouse, now a slightly less elegant pizza shop. He became an associate of the Royal Academy and contributed articles to the Analytical Review, an important new magazine which provided a forum for radical political and religious ideas, and was often critical of the government and supportive of French revolutionaries. Fuseli very much prided himself on his intellectual and painterly prowess. But it seems he did not include his wife in his cerebral and cultured social life, leaving her at home as he attended literary soirees and showed off in coffee shop debates. And he was quite taken when he met the early feminist writer Mary Wollstonecraft, known for her book Thoughts on the Education of Daughters, and her radical idea that women were not naturally inferior to men, but only appeared so because of their lack of education. Wollstonecraft also contributed to the Analytical Review, and had some equally unconventional views about marriage, having had a daughter out of wedlock. What may have started as a friendship between two original thinkers soon became more, and Mary became rather obsessed. She was enraptured by his mind, writing about the grandeur of his soul and his quickness of comprehension and lovely sympathy. There was talk of a trip to Paris together, but Mrs. Fuseli soon put a stop to that, after which Mary proposed that they all live together in a ménage à trois, which he quite liked the sound of, but which his wife once again very firmly closed down. His and Mary's publisher, Joseph Johnson, advised them that an open scandal would do immense harm to their reputations, so Fuseli decided to cool things down, and Mary slunk off to France to escape the humiliation of the affair and to see for herself the revolutionary event she had just celebrated in her book, Vindication of the Rights of Men. Fuseli later said, "I hate clever women. They are only troublesome." In 1790, he became a full member of the Royal Academy, presenting his painting on Scandinavian mythology, Thor battering the Midgard serpent, as his diploma work. At around the same time, he began to develop plans for opening a John Milton-themed gallery, along the same lines as Boydell's Shakespeare Gallery, and began creating works for the venture. 9 years later, he was appointed Professor of Painting to the Academy, and his Milton Gallery finally opened with 47 paintings, many of them very large. But although the critics praised his work, the public showed little interest, and it was a commercial failure, closing after less than a year. In 1802, there was a temporary peace in the Napoleonic Wars, and Fuseli was able to visit Paris to see the art treasures looted by Napoleon from his various campaigns around Europe. The following year, he was chosen as keeper of the Royal Academy, and he resigned his professorship to concentrate on writing and art history, bringing out an edition of Matthew Pilkington's Lives of the Painters. In 1810, he resumed his professorship of painting and continued to hold both offices at the Royal Academy until his death. When Italian sculptor Antonio Canova visited England, he was so taken with Fuseli's work that on returning to Rome in 1817 he set about getting him elected as a member of the Accademia di San Luca. In his 84th year, after a life of uninterrupted good health, he suddenly became ill. His doctors were unable to identify what was wrong with him, and he died a few days later. He was buried in St Paul's Cathedral near his friends and fellow artists Sir Joshua Reynolds and John Opie. His widow, keen to preserve his reputation, scurried around the house and collected up all of his erotic drawings, of which there were many, and burned them. Some have survived, and they really are quite spicy. These are a few examples censored for modern sensibilities. Fuseli created more than 200 paintings and 800 drawings and designs. The art history books say he was not noted as a colourist, but considered a master of chiaroscuro, sharp contrasts of light and shadow for maximum dramatic impact. And he was known for deliberately exaggerating the proportions of the human body and casting his figures into anguished, contorted poses. It has been suggested that one of the reasons his work appears so modern is that his muscle-bound men and impossibly proportioned women have much in common with today's comic book superheroes. In his work, Fuseli repeatedly visits the world of dreams and visions, the supernatural and the mythical. As a teacher, he often said, one of the most unexplored regions of art are dreams. In comparison to many of his more conservative contemporaries, Fuseli is said to have forged a radical new style, passionate, unrestrained, challenging convention, reflecting the revolutionary spirit of the age with its questioning of all that had gone before. He produced no landscapes and ignored the financial rewards of painting portraits of pampered aristocrats, preferring earthier, more visceral, more exciting subjects. As a teacher, he had many pupils, including David Wilkie and Edwin Landseer, and William Blake, 16 years his junior, was heavily influenced by his style. Fuseli's biographer described his most famous painting as having no equal in the originality of its conception, and it was much imitated. It was also widely used in satirical prints to mock those doing the sitting or those being sat upon, as in this Rowlandson caricature of politician Charles Fox. Poets found themselves drawn to the darker realms of the dream world depicted by Fuseli, as in these lines of Percy Bysshe Shelley. And the nightmare probably influenced Percy's young wife Mary Shelley in her Gothic novel Frankenstein. Her parents, Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin, both knew Fuseli, her mother very well indeed, and it is likely that she would have been familiar with the painting. Shelley's description of the murder scene of Frankenstein's bride by his creature seems very close to Fuseli's painting. She was there, lifeless and inanimate, thrown across the bed, her hair hanging down and her pale and distorted features half covered by hair. And Edgar Allan Poe was probably thinking of the nightmare in his 1839 short story The Fall of the House of Usher, in which the narrator compares a painting in Usher's house to a Fuseli work, and reveals that an irrepressible tremor gradually pervaded my frame, and at length there sat upon my heart an incubus of utterly causeless alarm. Fuseli's picture has been interpreted by modern sleep experts as a vivid pictorial representation of sleep paralysis, a relatively common but often very scary phenomenon during the transition from sleep to wakefulness, in which a person is conscious but in a state of complete bodily paralysis. During an episode, the person may experience hallucinations, seeing, hearing or feeling things that are not there. Unlike many of the things I discuss on this channel, I've experienced this one myself. Only for a few seconds and fortunately without hallucinations, but quite unnerving until I realised what was going on. We understand the physiological mechanisms of sleep much better now, but for a long time the dream world was very much the province of psychoanalytic theorists. Sigmund Freud had a print of the nightmare in his apartment in Vienna, and Carl Jung discussed Fuseli's nightmare and some of his other works in his book Man and His Symbols. And of course, the painting plays a major visual role in Ken Russell's completely over-the-top but endlessly entertaining film Gothic. And you may remember from my video on John Polidori, writer of the first English-language vampire story, and a character in Ken Russell's film, that the topic of research that led to his medical degree was onirodynia, or troubled sleep. In other words, sleepwalking and nightmares. And I just wonder if Polidori's interest in this topic may have been stimulated by seeing Henry Fuseli's Gothic masterpiece, The Nightmare. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this one. I think we can add Fuseli to the list of artists who've produced groundbreaking work of great psychological depth, but without showing any signs of mental instability themselves. If you'd like to find out more about his life, you can tackle the enormously detailed 3-volume biography published soon after his death, which is on the Internet Archive, or try one of the more succinct biographies which I've added to my Amazon store page. As always, I'd love to hear your views on this video and any suggestions you have for future topics. And once again, a big thank you to all those who've signed up as members. This really supports the channel. But apart from that, I'll sign off now and look forward to seeing you again soon for more insane history. Goodbye.